At 9:17 on Christmas Eve, Claire Donovan watched her husband button his wool coat while the dinner she had spent 4 hours preparing went cold. Outside their Manhattan apartment, snow drifted past the windows. Inside, the Christmas tree glowed beside 3 stockings. One said Harrison, one said Claire. The smallest had no name yet. Claire rested one hand over her 31-week belly as the baby moved. "You're leaving?" she asked. Harrison Mercer glanced at his iPhone. "There's an emergency at the Lexington property. A pipe burst near the restaurant kitchen." Claire looked at him carefully. After 8 years of marriage, she knew how Harrison lied. He added details, too many details. "On Christmas Eve, I own hotels. Claire problems. Don't check the calendar." He picked up his Mercedes keys. Claire's eyes moved toward the dining table. 2 plates, 2 crystal glasses, a roast she had made because it was his favorite. Beside the tree sat a Tiffany box containing an ornament engraved for the baby's first Christmas next year. Harrison barely looked at any of it. "Don't wait up," he said. Claire felt something inside her finally become still. 3 hours earlier, Harrison had left the family iPad charging on the kitchen counter. A message had appeared across the screen. "Sienna Blake, I got the fireplace going. Drive carefully. I wish you could stay until morning." Claire had not opened the conversation. She hadn't needed to. For 6 months, she had ignored late meetings, unfamiliar perfume, canceled doctor appointments, and the way Harrison carried his phone everywhere. She had told herself marriage required trust. Tonight, trust had finally stopped requiring her humiliation. Harrison reached for the door. "Go spend Christmas with her," Claire said. His hand froze slowly. He turned. "What did you say with Sienna?" The color left his face. "Claire, go. You're misunderstanding something." "No." Her voice surprised even her. It wasn't angry. It was tired. Harrison stepped closer. "You're pregnant. You're emotional. Let's not turn a message into something it isn't." Claire stared at him. There it was. Not an apology, an accusation. She slipped off her wedding ring. Harrison's expression changed. "Don't be dramatic." Claire placed the ring beneath the Christmas tree beside the unopened Tiffany box. Then she looked at the man she had loved for nearly a decade. "If you walk through that door tonight, Harrison, don't expect to find the same wife waiting when you come back." For 1 second, she hoped he would remove his coat. She hoped he would choose her, their child, their marriage. Harrison looked at the ring, then at his phone. He opened the door. "I'll deal with this tomorrow." The door closed. Claire stood motionless until she heard the elevator descend. Only then did she cry. Not loudly, she covered her mouth because somehow she still felt the need to protect her unborn son from the sound of his mother breaking. Minutes passed. Then the baby kicked. Claire wiped her face. Upstairs, hidden behind old Christmas decorations, was the wooden box she had found 2 days earlier among Harrison's late father's belongings. She brought it downstairs. Inside was a Mont Blanc fountain pen, a small brass key, and an envelope written in William Mercer's handwriting. Claire opened it. The first line made her blood run cold. "Eleanor, I failed you as a father once. I will not let Harrison erase you twice." Claire read the sentence again. Eleanor. Who was Eleanor? Then she noticed an address beneath the letter. Woodstock, Vermont. Claire looked toward the front door Harrison had just walked through. For the first time that night, the affair was no longer the secret, frightening her most. By sunrise, Harrison would return expecting tears, apologies, and another chance. He would find Claire's wedding ring beneath the Christmas tree, but Claire would be gone, and she was about to meet the woman her husband had spent years making sure she never knew existed. At 6:52 Christmas morning, Harrison Mercer stepped out of the elevator carrying the smell of wood smoke and another woman's perfume. He had spent the drive back to Manhattan preparing his explanation. The snow had become dangerous. The Lexington property had required more attention than expected. His phone battery had died. If Claire mentioned Sienna's message, Harrison would tell her she had misunderstood a professional friendship. By breakfast, he believed he could calm everything down. He had done it before. The apartment door opened. Claire. Silence. Harrison removed his coat. The Christmas tree was still glowing. The dining table remained exactly as he had left it, except the candles had burned down into hardened pools of wax. 2 untouched plates sat beneath the chandelier. Claire. He walked toward the stairs. Then he saw her wedding ring. It rested beneath the tree beside the unopened Tiffany ornament. His stomach tightened. "Come on, Claire." He went upstairs. The bedroom was empty. The bed had not been slept in. He opened her closet. Most of her clothes remained, but her gray maternity coat was gone. So were 2 sweaters, several pairs of leggings, underwear, and the comfortable shoes she wore to prenatal appointments. Harrison checked the bathroom. Her toothbrush was missing. So were her prenatal vitamins. Now he stopped pretending she was hiding somewhere in the apartment. He called her straight to voicemail. "Claire, call me now." He ended the call and immediately tried again. Nothing. His irritation began turning into fear. Claire was 31 weeks pregnant. She had experienced dizziness twice that month. Her obstetrician had warned her to rest and avoid unnecessary stress. Harrison hurried downstairs and opened the hall closet. The hospital bag they had packed together was gone. Damn it. He called the building concierge. "This is Harrison Mercer in 41A. Did my wife leave last night?" The concierge hesitated. "Yes, Mr. Mercer." "When?" "Around 5:30 this morning." "Was she driving?" "No, sir." "An Uber Black picked her up." "Where did she go?" "I'm sorry, sir. I wouldn't have that information." Harrison ended the call. He opened the garage app on his iPhone. Claire's car was still downstairs. That frightened him more. She had planned this carefully enough not to drive through Christmas snow while pregnant. He looked around the living room again. Something else was wrong. Then he saw it. The wooden box. His father's box. It sat open on the coffee table. Harrison went completely still. He crossed the room and searched inside. The Mont Blanc fountain pen was gone. The brass key was gone. And the letter was gone. No. The word escaped before he could stop it. His phone was already in his hand, but he did not call the police. He did not call Claire's doctor. He called attorney Daniel Reeves, who had handled Mercer family matters since William Mercer's death. Daniel answered sleepily, "Harrison, it's Christmas morning. Did my wife contact you?" "What? Claire, did she call you?" "No." "Did she ask about my father's estate?" A pause. Daniel sounded awake now. "No." "Why?" Harrison walked to the window. "Did anyone named Eleanor Parker contact your office recently?" The silence on the other end lasted too long. "Harrison," Daniel said carefully, "why are you asking me that? Answer the question." "Not that I know of." Harrison closed his eyes. For almost 4 years he had controlled this problem. His father had created it. Harrison had contained it. At least that was how he had always explained it to himself. Then Claire had found the box. Harrison, what happened? Nothing. This doesn't sound like nothing. I'll call you later. He hung up. 20 minutes later, nearly 300 miles away, Claire sat beside a train window with both hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. She could no longer stomach. Her MacBook Pro rested inside her bag. So did her prenatal records, hospital bag, William's letter, the brass key, and the old Mont Blanc pen. She had barely slept. Every few minutes, guilt tried to pull her backward. Harrison was her husband. She was carrying his son. 8 years could not simply disappear because of one terrible Christmas Eve. Then she remembered Sienna's message. "I wish you could stay until morning." Claire looked down at her belly. "No," she whispered. Her baby moved beneath her hand. "You and I deserve the truth." Her phone suddenly regained a stronger signal. 23 missed calls appeared. Most were from Harrison. Then his messages arrived. "Where are you, Claire? Answer me. You shouldn't be traveling alone. We need to talk. Please tell me you're safe." For one painful second, those words sounded like the husband she remembered. Then the final message appeared. Claire's breathing stopped. It did not ask about the baby. It did not say he loved her. It said, "Grace, do not contact Eleanor Parker." Harrison had typed the wrong name first, deleted it, then sent another message seconds later. "Claire, do not contact that woman." Claire stared at the screen. He knew whatever William Mercer had tried to tell Eleanor before he died. Harrison already knew about it. Claire turned off her phone. Outside the window, the white landscape stretched north toward Vermont. She had left Manhattan believing she was chasing a dead man's secret. Now she understood something far more frightening. She was chasing a secret her living husband had deliberately buried. And somewhere in Woodstock, a woman named Eleanor Parker was about to tell Claire why. But Claire still had no idea that Eleanor had met Harrison before, and that he had once offered her $500,000 to disappear forever. By the time Claire Donovan reached Woodstock, Vermont, Christmas morning had settled into the kind of quiet she had almost forgotten existed. There were no horns, black cars, or glass towers. Snow covered the roofs along Main Street, and wreaths hung from old storefronts. Families walked carrying wrapped gifts. Claire felt strangely invisible. For 8 years, Christmas had meant the Mercer family. Expensive dinners, carefully chosen gifts, and Harrison making sure every detail looked perfect. This Christmas, her husband did not even know exactly where she was. Claire adjusted her maternity coat and checked the address on William Mercer's letter. Parker Pine Books. The bookstore stood between a bakery and an antique shop. A handwritten sign said, "Open Christmas morning coffee for anyone who needs company." Claire stared at those words. Then she pushed open the door. A bell kind. The store smelled of coffee, old paper, and cinnamon. Christmas music played softly. Near the register, a woman with silver-streaked brown hair sat with a Kindle beside her coffee. She looked close to 60. "Good morning," the woman said. "So, Merry Christmas." Claire's throat tightened. "Are you Eleanor Parker?" The woman's smile disappeared. "Yes, my name is Claire Donovan." No reaction. Claire forced herself to continue. "Claire Mercer." Eleanor's hand stopped halfway toward her cup. Her eyes dropped immediately to Claire's pregnant belly, then returned to her face. "Harrison's wife." Claire nodded for several seconds. Neither woman spoke. "How did you find me?" Eleanor asked. Claire reached into her bag. "I found something that belonged to William Mercer." At the name, Eleanor's face hardened. Claire placed the old Mont Blanc fountain pen on the counter. Eleanor stared at it. Her fingers began trembling. "Where did you get that?" "It was in a box William left behind." Eleanor slowly picked up the pen. Whatever anger had been in her expression vanished. He still had it. "You recognize it?" Eleanor gave a small, broken laugh. "I gave this to him." Claire frowned. "I bought it at a used office supply store when I was 19. It cost me almost everything I had saved that summer." She turned the pen between her fingers. "He was starting his first hotel project. He told me one day he'd sign something important with it." Claire suddenly felt cold despite the warmth of the bookstore. "You knew William that long ago?" Eleanor looked at her. "He was my father." Claire said nothing. She had prepared herself for a former employee, an old business partner, perhaps even a woman William had loved. Not this. "Harrison has a sister. Half-sister. Why has nobody ever mentioned you?" Eleanor's expression became distant. "That depends on which Mercer you ask." Claire lowered herself into a chair. Eleanor locked the front door and turned the sign to closed. "Are you all right? I'm 31 weeks pregnant. I found out my husband is sleeping with another woman, and this morning I learned he has a sister." Eleanor stared at her, then quietly said, "Sit. I'll make you tea." That simple kindness nearly broke Claire. 10 minutes later, they sat in the back of the bookstore. Eleanor showed Claire an old photograph. William Mercer looked barely 25. He wore jeans and a cheap winter jacket. In his arms was a little girl with dark pigtails. "That's you. I was 4. What happened?" "My mother and William were young. He wanted a different life. Eventually, he chose it." Eleanor spoke without bitterness, which somehow made the story sadder. "William sent money occasionally. Then he married Harrison's mother, built Mercer House Hospitality, and became a respected businessman." Eleanor became a secret. "Did Harrison know?" Eleanor looked directly at Claire. "Yes." Claire's chest tightened. "How long?" "Years." "That's impossible." "No, it's inconvenient. There's a difference." Claire thought about Harrison's message. "Do not contact that woman. William found me again before he died." Eleanor continued. "He apologized. He wanted to tell the family." "Did he?" "He ran out of time." Claire pulled William's letter from her bag. Eleanor recognized the handwriting before Claire unfolded it. Her eyes filled. "I never received this. I think he wanted you to." Eleanor read silently. Halfway down the page, tears slipped over her cheeks. Claire looked away, giving her privacy. Finally, Eleanor folded the letter carefully. "I spent years wishing he would say these things. I'm sorry." "So, and I for what?" Eleanor looked at Claire's belly. "For whatever Harrison did that brought you here." Claire swallowed. "You said Harrison knew about you." Eleanor stood and walked toward a small safe beneath a desk. She entered a code and removed a thick envelope. "Harrison came here 3 weeks after our father's funeral." Claire's heart began pounding. "He came to see you?" "He brought an attorney." Eleanor placed the envelope in front of Claire. Inside was a settlement agreement. Claire read the first page, then the number. "What is this?" "Your husband offered me $500,000. For what?" Eleanor's eyes held hers to sign away any claim connected to William's estate, accept a confidentiality agreement, and never contact the Mercer family again. Claire stared at Harrison's signature. Everything she had believed about her marriage shifted. "Did you take it?" Eleanor shook her head. "I didn't want his money." "Then what did you want?" "My father to tell the truth." Claire's eyes burned. Eleanor reached back into the envelope. "There's something else you should see." She removed a second document. This one carried the letter head of Mercer House Hospitality. Claire recognized it immediately, and when she saw the authorization signature at the bottom, She realized Harrison had not tried to buy Eleanor's silence with his own money. He had used company funds to make his sister disappear. Claire stared at the document until the words began to blur. Mercer House Hospitality. The company name appeared across the top. Below it was a payment authorization for legal consulting expenses connected to a proposed family settlement, amount $250,000 authorized by Harrison Mercer. Claire looked up. This came from the company. Eleanor nodded. That was the first payment. First, Harrison offered me $500,000, half immediately, half after I signed everything. Claire read the page again. Before marrying Harrison, she had spent years analyzing hospitality acquisitions. She knew the difference between a personal expense and a legitimate corporate expense. A private family settlement did not belong on a hotel company's books simply because its CEO wanted it there. Did you receive any of this money? No. Did you sign anything? No. Then why do you have the authorization? The attorney Harrison brought accidentally included it in the document package. When they asked for it back, I made a copy. Claire almost smiled. You didn't trust him. I had just met my half-brother for the first time, and he arrived with a lawyer and a check. That answer hurt because it sounded exactly like Harrison, not the Harrison who had held Claire's hand during fertility treatments, not the man who had painted the nursery himself, because he wanted their son to know his father had prepared a place for him. This was the Harrison she had seen last night, controlled, practical, cold whenever another person became inconvenient. Eleanor poured more tea. After William died, Harrison came here on a Monday morning. He sat where you're sitting. What did he say? That our father had been confused near the end. Claire's head lifted. William was sick, but he wasn't confused. I know. I was with him almost every day. Eleanor studied her. You took care of him for nearly 9 months. Claire remembered crushing William's medication into applesauce when swallowing became difficult. She remembered Harrison missing dinners because of meetings. She remembered sitting beside William at 3 in the morning when pain kept him awake. Harrison had praised her for being such a good daughter-in-law. Now the memory felt different. What else did Harrison tell you? He said William's attempt to bring me into the family would destroy everything he had built. Why? Scandal, inheritance questions, his mother's feelings, investors. He had a reason for everything. Eleanor looked toward the snowy window. Then he told me nobody in the Mercer family wanted me. Claire felt something tighten inside her. Did he ask them? Eleanor gave a sad smile. That question took me 3 years to ask myself. Claire lowered her eyes. Harrison had not merely hidden a relative. He had decided who deserved to belong. Her iPhone vibrated on the table. Harrison. Claire let it ring. The voicemail arrived. Then another message. Please call me. Whatever you found, Dad was not himself near the end. Claire felt anger rise through her exhaustion. The same sentence, the same excuse. He's saying William wasn't mentally competent. Eleanor's expression changed. That's what he told me. Claire opened her MacBook Pro. What are you doing? Checking something. Years earlier, William had asked Claire to help organize financial records while Mercer House Hospitality prepared to refinance several properties. Claire still had archived copies of documents she had legally worked on. She searched by date. Eleanor watched silently. Claire found board materials, bank correspondence, acquisition approvals. William had continued signing major documents during the same period Harrison now claimed he had been confused. One transaction involved the refinancing of a Boston hotel worth tens of millions of dollars. Harrison himself had relied on William's approval. Claire leaned back. He can't have it both ways. What do you mean? He can't tell investors his father was competent enough to approve a major refinancing, then tell you William was too confused to make decisions about his own family. For the first time, Eleanor looked hopeful. Then Claire found something else, a payment ledger. She opened it. Her breathing slowed. 3 months after William's death, Mercer House Hospitality had paid $250,000 to a law firm. Description: Hale Family Settlement Council. Hale? Claire asked. My married name before my husband died. Claire turned the screen toward Eleanor. The payment had actually been made. But you said you never received money. I didn't. Then where did $250,000 go? Eleanor stared at the screen. Claire's analyst instincts took over. This was no longer only about an affair or an abandoned daughter. Money had moved. Someone had approved it. And the person supposedly receiving the settlement had never seen a dollar. Claire reached for her phone. There was one person who might understand the transaction. Martin Cole, former controller of Mercer House Hospitality, her old mentor. Before she could call him, Eleanor touched her arm. Claire, there's something I haven't told you. Claire looked up. Eleanor walked back to the safe and removed a small brass key identical in shape to the one Claire had found in William's box. Claire stared at both keys. Why do you have that? Because your father-in-law gave it to me 2 weeks before he died. A key to what? Eleanor closed her fingers around it. A safe deposit box. Claire's pulse quickened. What's inside? Eleanor's eyes filled with fear. I don't know. I was too afraid to open it. Why? Because William told me that if Harrison ever tried to make me disappear, the truth about what he intended for me would be waiting inside. And for the first time, Claire realized William Mercer had expected his own son to betray his final wishes. Claire did not call Martin Cole immediately. For nearly a minute, she simply stared at the 2 brass keys lying side by side on Eleanor Parker's kitchen table. One had been hidden in William Mercer's wooden box in Manhattan. The other had remained with Eleanor for almost 4 years. 2 keys, 2 women, 1 secret Harrison had never expected them to compare. Outside, snow continued falling across Woodstock. Inside, Eleanor wrapped both hands around her coffee as if she needed the warmth to steady herself. William said the box was at First Vermont Trust, she said. He told me not to open it unless Harrison tried to stop me from being acknowledged. And then Harrison showed up after the funeral with a lawyer. Claire looked toward her MacBook Pro. The $250,000 payment still glowed on the screen. Hale Family Settlement Council. Eleanor had never received it. Claire's old instincts as a financial analyst began pushing through the grief. Do you remember the attorney's name? Jonathan Price. Claire typed it into her notes. Firm. Price Adler and Kent, Manhattan. That sounded familiar. Claire searched her archived files. There it was. The firm had handled several outside matters for Mercer House Hospitality during the year William died. This wasn't random, Claire said. What wasn't? Harrison didn't hire a private family lawyer to deal with you. He used a law firm already billing the company. Eleanor frowned. Is that illegal? Not automatically. Claire was careful. Companies sometimes pay legal bills that involve executives, but the expense has to serve a legitimate business purpose and be documented correctly. A personal inheritance dispute is different. So what does the payment prove? Not enough yet. Eleanor looked surprised. Claire closed the ledger. I'm not going to pretend one suspicious payment means we've solved everything. That was the difference between Claire and Harrison. Harrison started with the outcome he wanted, then built the explanation around it. Claire wanted facts first. Her phone vibrated again. Harrison. This time she answered, "Claire." His voice carried relief. "Thank God. Where are you?" "I'm safe." "Where?" I said, "I'm safe. You're 31 weeks pregnant. You disappeared without telling me." Claire almost laughed. "You left your pregnant wife alone on Christmas Eve to sleep with Sienna Blake." Silence. "I did not sleep with anyone." "Then why did she message you about the fireplace?" "You went through my messages. That's your concern." Claire listened to herself. She closed her eyes. There it was again, his favorite move. Make her reaction the problem. "Did you offer Eleanor Parker $500,000 after your father died?" The silence changed. It became heavy. "Who told you that?" "That isn't an answer. You don't understand what happened. Then explain it. My father was sick. He was signing refinancing documents. He had good days and bad days, so he was competent when his signature helped Mercer House, but confused when he wanted to acknowledge his daughter." "Claire." His voice hardened. "You have no idea what that woman wanted." Eleanor heard him from across the table. Claire watched her face fall. "What did she want, Harrison?" "Money." Eleanor looked away. Claire felt anger rise. "She rejected your settlement because she wanted more. That's not what she told me. You believe a stranger over your husband?" Claire's hand moved protectively over her belly. "No, I believe the paperwork." Another silence. That answer frightened him. She could hear it. "Come home," Harrison said, suddenly softer. "We'll talk. We'll fix this." For one brief second, Claire heard the man she had married, the man who used to bring her coffee during late-night financial modeling, the man who once drove 3 hours because her mother had fallen, and Claire was too scared to travel alone. Her eyes burned. Maybe part of him still existed. Then Harrison added, "Bring Dad's box with you." Claire opened her eyes. There it was. Not her. The box. "What are you afraid I'll find?" "I'm afraid you'll hurt yourself chasing something that isn't real." Claire ended the call. Her hand trembled. Eleanor said nothing for several seconds. Finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry for what? That you had to hear who he is while carrying his child." Claire stared at the Christmas lights reflected in the dark window. The affair isn't the first lie. No, it's just the first lie I finally stopped explaining away. Eleanor reached across the table and covered Claire's hand. That simple touch nearly broke her. Claire cried quietly, not because Harrison had chosen another woman, because she finally understood how many times she had chosen Harrison over her own instincts. When the tears passed, she opened her phone and called Martin Cole. He answered on the 4th ring. "Claire, Merry Christmas." "Martin, I'm sorry to call today. You sound upset. I need to ask about an old Mercer house payment." POW? What payment?" $250,000. Price, Adler, and Kent. Hale Family Settlement Council. Martin stopped breathing for a moment. Claire knew immediately. "You remember it." "Claire, where did you get that?" "Old records. Does Harrison know you're looking?" "No." Martin lowered his voice. "Keep it that way." Claire sat straighter. "Why?" "Because that payment never belonged in the company ledger." Eleanor looked at her. Claire gripped the phone. "Then why was it there?" Martin hesitated. "Because Harrison ordered me to put it there." Claire's pulse jumped. "And Martin?" "Yes." "Where did the money actually go?" His answer came slowly. "I never knew." Then he said something worse. "But William asked me about that exact account before he died." Claire looked at the 2 brass keys. "When 2 days before he entered hospice?" "What did he say?" Martin's voice became almost a whisper. "He told me Harrison was moving money around something that should never have touched the company." Claire felt the room close around her. "And then William told me that if anything happened to him, the truth was somewhere Harrison couldn't reach." Claire's eyes dropped to the keys. For the first time, she understood the safe deposit box might not contain an inheritance at all. It might contain proof William had been investigating his own son. The next morning, Claire woke before sunrise. For several seconds, she did not remember where she was. Then she saw the unfamiliar ceiling, the soft yellow light from the hallway, and Eleanor Parker asleep in an armchair beside the guest bed with a knitted blanket over her legs. Claire rested both hands over her stomach. The baby moved a slow, steady kick. "Good morning," she whispered. She had barely slept. Martin Cole's words kept replaying in her mind. William had known Harrison was moving money. The William had been afraid enough to hide something where Harrison could not reach it. And now Claire and Eleanor had both keys. By 8:30, they were dressed and standing outside First Vermont Trust. The bank had reopened after Christmas. Eleanor looked pale. "You can still change your mind," Claire said. Eleanor gave a nervous laugh. "I waited almost 4 years. If I leave now, I'll spend another 4 wondering what was inside." They entered together. The branch manager checked Eleanor's identification, reviewed the account records, then disappeared into a secure area. Claire expected some dramatic complication. Instead, the process was ordinary. Forms, signatures, identification, waiting that made everything feel more real. 20 minutes later, the manager led them into a private viewing room and placed a long metal box on the table. Eleanor inserted her key. Claire inserted William's. Both locks turned. Neither woman moved. Finally, Eleanor whispered, "Open it." Claire lifted the lid. There was no cash, no jewelry, no secret fortune, only documents, a stack of old photographs, several sealed envelopes, a folder labeled East Planning, and one small velvet pouch. Claire opened the folder first. Inside was a draft amendment to William Mercer's family trust. Her eyes moved carefully across each page. The language was formal, but the intention was clear. William wanted Eleanor acknowledged as his biological daughter. He intended to leave her a defined portion of his personal estate, separate from Harrison's operating control of Mercer House Hospitality. Claire exiled. "This doesn't give you the company." Eleanor almost smiled. "I never wanted the company. It matters because Harrison may have assumed you were coming after everything. I wasn't." Claire turned another page. The document had attorney notes, dates, revision comments, but the signature page was blank. Claire's heart sank. "This is only a draft." Eleanor looked at her. "So it means nothing. It means William intended to do something, but intention and an executed legal document are not the same thing." For the first time that morning, disappointment crossed Eleanor's face. Claire hated seeing it. She kept searching. One envelope was addressed to Arthur Bennett, another to Martin Cole. A third was marked, "For Eleanor." Eleanor's hands began trembling. "You open it," she said. Claire shook her head. "No, that one is yours." Eleanor sat down slowly. She opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. She read the first few lines silently, then stopped. Her mouth tightened. Claire waited. Eleanor tried again. She made it farther this time before tears filled her eyes. "I can't." Claire moved closer. "Do you want me to read it?" Eleanor handed her the letter. Claire began softly. My dear Ellie, there are apologies that come too late to repair what they broke. Eleanor covered her mouth. Claire continued. William wrote that he had spent decades convincing himself that financial support was enough. It was not. He had missed birthdays, graduations, Eleanor's wedding, the birth of her daughter. He admitted that success had made him more cowardly, not less. The more respected the Mercer name became, the more afraid he became of admitting how that family had begun. Claire's voice shook. Then she reached the final paragraph. I cannot ask you to forgive me, but I can refuse to let my silence become Harrison's inheritance. Claire stopped. Eleanor was crying openly now, not loudly, just years of pain, finally finding somewhere to go. Claire placed the letter on the table and held her. For a moment, neither woman cared about trusts, payments, or Harrison. This was simply a daughter receiving words from her father 4 years too late. Then Claire felt a sharp tightening across her abdomen. She froze. Eleanor pulled back. Claire, I'm fine. Another pain came, stronger. Claire gripped the edge of the table. That doesn't look fine. It's probably Braxton Hicks. You're 31 weeks pregnant, I know. Then we're going to the hospital. Claire wanted to argue. Instead, another cramp took her breath away. 40 minutes later, she was lying in a hospital room with monitors strapped around her stomach. The baby's heartbeat filled the room, fast, steady, beautiful. The doctor explained that Claire was experiencing premature contractions, likely worsened by exhaustion and stress. They would monitor her closely. Eleanor stayed beside her. A nurse checked the emergency contact information. Harrison Mercer. Claire hesitated. Yes. The nurse called him. No answer. She tried again 10 minutes later. No answer. A third time. Still nothing. Nearly 300 meners away. Harrison sat across from Sienna Blake at a quiet hotel restaurant. His iPhone vibrated beside his untouched coffee. Sienna looked at the screen. Is that a hospital? Harrison turned the phone face down. She's fine. Sienna stared at him. How do you know if you didn't answer? Harrison said nothing for the first time since their affair began. Sienna looked at him without admiration. Back in Vermont, Claire listened as the nurse said gently, We couldn't reach your husband. Eleanor reached for Claire's hand. Claire turned toward the monitor and listened to her son's heartbeat. She had never felt more frightened or more certain. Harrison had chosen not to answer again, but neither Claire nor Harrison knew that one of the documents still inside William's safe deposit box carried the name of a retired attorney who could prove the unsigned trust draft was not the final version. Claire woke to the sound of the fetal monitor. A steady rhythm filled the hospital room. For several seconds, she stared at the ceiling and tried to remember why her body felt so heavy. Then she saw Eleanor sitting beside the window. She was knitting. A small piece of pale blue yarn rested across her lap. Claire blinked. What are you making? Eleanor looked up. A blanket. Claire's eyes moved to her stomach. For him? Eleanor smiled. For whoever this little man decides to become. Something in Claire broke. She turned her face away, but the tears came anyway. Eleanor put the knitting down. Hey, I'm sorry for what? I don't even know you. Eleanor moved closer. You know enough. Claire looked at her. You stayed. Eleanor's expression softened. So did you. Claire frowned. With what? With your marriage. Probably longer than you should have. Claire closed her eyes. That hurt because it was true. The doctor came in 20 minutes later. The contractions had slowed. The baby remained stable. There was no immediate sign of labor, but Claire needed rest, hydration, and as little stress as possible. "You can go home later today," the doctor said, "but if the contractions return, you come straight back." Claire nodded. Home. The word felt strange now. Her home in Manhattan no longer felt like hers. Eleanor's small Vermont house felt safer than the apartment where Claire had spent 8 years building a marriage. Across town, Sienna Blake sat across from Harrison Mercer at a hotel restaurant and watched him ignore another call. "You should answer that." Harrison barely glanced at the screen. "It's hand-lid. It's a spittle." "I know." Sienna stared at him. "You know, Claire gets anxious. She probably went in because the baby moved differently or she felt a cramp. You don't know that." Harrison reached for his coffee. "Sienna, I have been dealing with Claire's pregnancy for months." The sentence landed badly. Sienna's face changed. "Dealing with?" "That's not what I meant." It sounded pretty clear. Harrison said, "I'm under pressure. So is your pregnant wife. My marriage is complicated. You said it was over." "It is." "Then why are you so afraid of what she found?" Harrison looked at her. For the first time, Sienna saw something she had mistaken for confidence. Control. He needed to control the room, the conversation, the truth. She thought about all the things Harrison had told her. Claire was emotionally distant. Claire had stopped supporting him. Claire stayed only because she was pregnant. Now Claire had disappeared, and Harrison seemed more worried about old documents than whether she was safe. Sienna leaned back. "What is Eleanor Parker?" Harrison's face hardened. "Who told you that name?" "You did." "I did not. You said it last night on the phone with your lawyer." Harrison's jaw tightened. "That is a private family matter. So is your wife being in a hospital?" He stood. "We're not doing this here." Sienna did not follow. For the first time since the affair began, she watched him walk away without feeling chosen. She felt warned. Back at the hospital, Claire packed slowly. Her phone showed another message from Harrison. "Call me. No apology, no question about the baby, just an order." Claire placed the phone face down. Eleanor helped her into her coat. "There's something we missed yesterday," Eleanor said. "What?" "One of the envelopes in the safe deposit box." Claire looked at her. "The one marked for Arthur Bennett?" Eleanor nodded. "Do you know him?" "The name sounds familiar. William said he was the only lawyer who ever told him no." Claire almost smiled. That already makes him interesting. They returned to the bank that afternoon. The branch manager brought them back into the private room. The box looked less frightening now. Claire opened the envelope addressed to Arthur Bennett. Inside was a short handwritten note and a business card. "Arthur Bennett, Bennett Estate Counsel, retired." Claire read the note. If I do not get the chance to finish what we started, make sure Ellie knows I signed it." "Them?" Claire's pulse jumped. "Signed what?" Eleanor whispered. "The trust amendment." Claire searched the envelope again. Nothing else. No copy, no signature page, just that sentence. "I signed it." Claire took out her iPhone and searched Arthur Bennett's name, a retired estate attorney in Hanover, New Hampshire. There was a phone number. Claire called. It rang 5 times. A man answered. "Bennett." "Mr. Bennett, my name is Claire Donovan Mercer." Silence. Then William's daughter-in-law. "Yes." "How did you get this number?" "I found a note from William." Another pause. Claire continued. It mentioned Eleanor Parker. Arthur stopped breathing for a second. "Where are you?" "Vermont. Is Eleanor with you?" "Yes." "Put me on speaker." Claire did. Arthur's voice softened. "Ellie." Eleanor covered her mouth. Arthur, I'm sorry. For what? For waiting this long. Claire felt the room become still. Mr. Bennet, she said, William wrote that he signed something. We found a draft trust amendment, but it wasn't executed. Arthur answered carefully. That draft was not the final document. Claire and Eleanor looked at each other. Do you have the final version? No. Hope disappeared for half a second. Then Arthur continued, But I witnessed William sign it. Claire sat straighter. Where is it? That is what I have spent 4 years trying to understand. Eleanor's voice shook. Did Harrison know it existed? Arthur was silent. Too silent. Finally, he said, Yes. Claire closed her eyes. Arthur continued, And Claire, before we talk any further, you need to understand something. What? William did not simply change his estate plan. Claire's hand tightened around the phone. He also wrote a letter explaining why. To whom? To the family. Claire looked at Eleanor. Arthur's next words chilled her, and Harrison made sure nobody ever read it. By the time Claire ended the call, she knew the secret was bigger than an inheritance William had left behind a confession, and Harrison had spent 4 years keeping his own family from hearing it. Arthur Bennet agreed to meet them the next morning. Claire expected an office with dark wood walls, legal books, and framed degrees. Instead, Arthur lived in a modest white house outside Hanover, New Hampshire, where snow covered the front steps, and an old Volvo sat beneath a maple tree. Eleanor looked nervous as Claire parked the rental car. You don't have to go in, Claire said. Yes, I do. Arthur opened the door before they knocked. He was tall, thin, and slightly stooped with silver hair and reading glasses hanging from a cord around his neck. The moment he saw Eleanor, his face changed. Ellie. Eleanor stood still. Arthur stepped forward, then stopped himself. I should have called you years ago. Why didn't you? Arthur looked ashamed, because lawyers become very good at convincing themselves that silence is professionalism. He invited them inside. The living room smelled faintly of coffee and burning wood. A legal pad rested beside an old leather folder on the dining table. Claire recognized William Mercer's handwriting on the first page inside. Arthur noticed, That folder is why I asked you here. Eleanor sat slowly. Did my father really sign the amendment? Yes. Arthur answered without hesitation. I watched him sign it. A notary was present. William was alert, understood what he was doing, and asked questions throughout the meeting. Claire leaned forward. Then why wasn't it processed? Arthur removed his glasses. Because William's health declined quickly, the original was supposed to be transferred with the rest of his estate documents to the firm Harrison selected. Price, Adler, and Kent. Yes. Claire exchanged a look with Eleanor. Arthur continued. After William died, I requested confirmation that the amendment had been incorporated into the estate administration, and I was told the family was reviewing several documents because of questions about William's capacity. Claire's jaw tightened. The same argument Harrison used with Eleanor. Arthur nodded. I challenged it. What happened? Harrison called me personally. Eleanor's face hardened. What did he say? That his father had been confused, that the family did not want unnecessary conflict, and that Eleanor had already been offered a fair private resolution. Arthur looked directly at her. I knew enough to suspect that wasn't the whole truth. Then why didn't you fight? I no longer represented the estate? The answer was painfully ordinary. No conspiracy, no secret judge, just a retired attorney who had lost authority once another firm took control. Arthur opened the leather folder. I kept copies of my correspondence. Claire reviewed the emails. Arthur had asked about the amendment 3 times. Each time, the response became more vague. One email from Harrison stood out. "We need to protect the integrity of Dad's final wishes without giving credibility to opportunistic claims." Eleanor read the sentence twice. Opportunistic. Her voice was quiet. "He called me opportunistic." Claire reached for her hand. Arthur looked down. "There's more." He removed a sealed envelope. The front read, "To my family Christmas." Eleanor stopped breathing. "This is the letter, a copy." Arthur explained that William had written the original during his final Christmas season. He asked Arthur to include it with the estate documents. Arthur made a photocopy for his private file. Claire looked at him. "Did Harrison know about it?" "Yes." "Did he read it?" "I believe so," Eleanor whispered, "and he still buried it." Arthur slid the letter across the table. Eleanor could not touch it. "You read it," she told Claire. Claire opened the envelope. William's handwriting was weaker than in the earlier letter, but still clear. "My family. There is something I should have told you many years ago. Before I became the man whose name appeared on hotels and contracts, I became a father. Her name is Eleanor." Eleanor lowered her head. Claire continued. William did not excuse himself. He wrote about fear, about ambition, about the shame of allowing social expectations to become more important than a child. He admitted sending money while withholding his name. He admitted watching Eleanor grow from a distance because appearing publicly would have forced him to explain the life he had hidden. Then came the sentence that broke Eleanor. "A father does not become honorable simply because he provides money. He becomes honorable when his child knows she belongs to him." Eleanor covered her face. Arthur turned away. Claire's voice shook. William wrote that he had asked Eleanor to forgive him, but understood if she never could. Then he addressed Harrison directly. "Harrison, if you are reading this, do not protect my reputation by repeating my cowardice." Claire stopped. Eleanor looked up. "Keep reading." Claire did. William warned his son not to confuse inheritance with ownership of the family itself. He wrote that Eleanor deserved acknowledgement, whether she accepted $1 or none. And then in the final paragraph, William wrote, "If my name survives, let it survive honestly. If it cannot survive the truth, then it deserves to change." The room was silent. Eleanor cried without trying to hide it. "I waited my whole life for him to say I was his daughter." Claire moved beside her. "He did. Too late." "Yes, but he did." Eleanor nodded through tears. For several minutes, the inheritance stopped mattering. The company stopped mattering. Even Harrison stopped mattering. A daughter had finally heard her father say the word she had needed since childhood. Later, Arthur handed Claire another document. "This is important." It was a delivery receipt. The original Christmas letter and signed amendment had been transferred together to Price, Adler, and Kent, received by Jonathan Price, date 4 days after William Mercer's death. Claire stared at the signature. So the documents reached Harrison's lawyers. Yes. Then somebody knows where the originals went. Arthur nodded. "There's one more person you need to speak with." "Who?" "Martin Cole." Claire frowned. "I already called him." Arthur looked surprised. "Then ask him what William gave him during their last private meeting." Claire's pulse quickened. Martin said William asked about company money. Arthur shook his head. "That wasn't all." Claire leaned forward. "What else did William give him?" Arthur's expression became serious. "A sealed digital archive." Claire went still. What was in it? I don't know. Did Harrison know? Arthur looked directly at her. That is exactly what William was afraid of. By the time Claire and Eleanor left Arthur's house, they knew the missing trust amendment was only half the story. Somewhere, Martin Cole might still possess the one file William had hidden from his own son. And Harrison had spent 4 years making sure nobody asked for it. Claire called Martin Cole before they were halfway back to Vermont. He answered on the second ring. "Claire, I spoke with Arthur Bennett." Silence. Claire watched snow slide past the passenger window. "He said William gave you something before he died." Martin did not respond. "Martin, I was hoping Arthur wouldn't involve you in this. That's not an answer." "No." His voice sounded tired. "It isn't." Claire looked at Eleanor, who was driving. "What did William give you?" Another pause. "A drive." Claire tightened her grip on the phone. "What kind of drive?" "Encrypted, small black casing. No label." "Do you still have it?" Martin exhaled. "Yes." Claire closed her eyes. For the first time in days, a piece of the puzzle had not disappeared. "Where are you?" "Lower Manhattan." "We're coming. You're pregnant." "I noticed." "Claire, this is not something you rush into. My husband left me on Christmas Eve, lied about his sister for years, and may have used company money to bury a family settlement. I think we passed rush into a while ago." Martin went quiet. Then he said, "Come tomorrow morning. My office, 10 Bas." Claire ended the call. Eleanor glanced at her. "He has it?" "Yes." "Do you trust him?" Claire thought about Martin. He had hired her years before Harrison ever entered her life. He had taught her how to read numbers without letting numbers tell the whole story. He once told her, "A clean spreadsheet can still hide a dirty decision. I trust him more than Harrison." That was not the same as complete trust. The next morning, Claire and Eleanor arrived at Martin's office near Wall Street. The building was old by Manhattan standards, wedged between newer glass towers. Martin's office was on the 12th floor. No grand boardroom, no assistants, just shelves of binders, an aging Bloomberg terminal, 2 monitors, and a framed photograph of Martin with his late wife. He stood when Claire entered. At 63, Martin looked almost exactly as she remembered, except for more gray in his beard. Then he saw her stomach. "Good God, I'm fine. You were in a hospital 2 days ago." Claire looked at him sharply. "How do you know that?" "Harrison called me." Eleanor stiffened. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing useful." Martin locked the office door. Then he opened a small fireproof cabinet. Inside was a black encrypted USB drive. Claire stared at it. "That's it. That's it. Why did William give it to you?" Martin sat down. "Because he didn't trust the transition after he died." "Transition of what?" "Control." Martin folded his hands. William knew Harrison wanted complete authority over Mercer House hospitality. That part wasn't unusual. Harrison had been effectively running the company for years. Then what was William afraid of? That Harrison was beginning to confuse control with ownership. Claire felt the words land. Martin continued, "A few months before William entered hospice, he asked me to review certain legal expenses. He thought personal matters were being routed through company accounts. The Hale settlement." "Yes. Did you approve it?" "I processed the payment after receiving authorization." Claire's expression hardened. Martin did not look away. "I regret that. Where did the money go? To Price, Adler, and Kent, not Eleanor." "No." Martin opened an archived ledger. "The firm built the company for strategic family risk consulting." Eleanor laughed bitterly. "So I was a risk." Martin looked ashamed. That was the description. Claire leaned forward. Was the payment disclosed to the board? Not in detail. Why not? Harrison grouped it under outside legal expenses. Claire's analyst mind started moving. That did not automatically make it criminal, but it could become a governance problem if the expense was personal and deliberately obscured. What's on the drive? Martin inserted it into an offline laptop. A password prompt appeared. He typed slowly. The screen opened to several folders. Legal Personnel Board email archive. Claire looked at him. William made this. He asked me to preserve copies. Martin opened the estate folder. There it was. A scanned PDF, Mercer Family Trust, Second Amendment. Claire stopped breathing. The final page carried William Mercer's signature, a notary seal, Arthur Bennett's witness signature, and a date. 6 weeks before William died, Eleanor covered her mouth. Claire scrolled back up. The amendment named Eleanor Parker as William's biological daughter and beneficiary of a defined portion of his personal estate. It did not give her Mercer House hospitality. It did not remove Harrison. It simply gave Ellie what William had promised, recognition and a lawful share. Eleanor began crying, not because of the money, because her name was there on official paper written beside the word daughter. Claire reached across the desk and held her hand. Martin looked away. After a moment, Claire asked the question that mattered. Did Harrison know this was signed? Martin did not answer immediately. Then he opened the email archive folder. He searched Harrison's name. One email appeared from Harrison Mercer to Martin Cole. Subject, Hale Amendment. Claire felt cold. Martin opened it. The message was short. Do not circulate the Hale Amendment until I decide how the family wants to handle it. Keep all copies restricted. This is not a board matter. Claire read it twice. Eleanor stopped crying. Her face became still. He knew. Martin nodded. Yes. And he lied. Yes. Claire sat back. The affair suddenly felt almost simple compared with this. Harrison had not misunderstood his father. He had not been confused. He had made a decision. He had decided Ellie's existence was inconvenient, so he buried her. Claire looked through the remaining folders. Then she saw another email chain. Harrison Jonathan Price. Subject, Claire Access Review. Her stomach tightened. Martin. He looked at the screen. His face changed. What? That wasn't there before. Claire opened the email. The date was 3 months earlier. Long before Christmas, long before Claire found the wooden box, Harrison had instructed legal and finance staff to review Claire's access to archived company files. Reason? Potential separation planning. Claire could barely breathe. 3 months ago, he had already been preparing for divorce. While telling her they were decorating a nursery together, while attending prenatal appointments, while sleeping beside her, Eleanor whispered, Claire. Claire kept reading. The final line was from Harrison. Make sure she doesn't know we're doing this until after the baby arrives. Claire stared at those words. The room seemed to shrink. This was no longer only about Sienna. It was no longer only about Ellie. Harrison had been planning to remove Claire too. Quietly, carefully, after she gave birth. And in that moment, Claire finally understood the pattern. Harrison Mercer did not betray women when he stopped loving them. He prepared to erase them the moment they became inconvenient. Harrison arrived at Claire's temporary apartment on Park Avenue, carrying white roses, a Tiffany box, and the expression of a man who had rehearsed every word before entering the building. Claire saw him through the security camera. For several seconds, she considered refusing to let him upstairs. Then she remembered the email. Make sure she doesn't know we're doing this until after the baby arrives. She pressed the intercom. Come up. Eleanor was staying at a nearby hotel. Martin had advised Claire not to discuss the archived files with Harrison until she had legal counsel. Claire agreed, but she wanted to hear what Harrison would say when he believed she still knew less than she did. 3 minutes later, he stood outside her door. He looked tired, really tired. His usually perfect hair was untidy and there were shadows beneath his eyes. When Claire opened the door, Harrison stared at her stomach first. "How's the baby?" "Stable." Relief crossed his face. "You should have told me you were in the hospital. They called you 3 times. Harrison looked away. "I was dealing with a crisis with Sienna." "No." Claire said nothing. Harrison held out the flowers. "These are for you." She did not take them. He slowly lowered his hand. "I ended things with Sienna." Claire's chest tightened despite herself. 8 years of marriage did not disappear because she had finally seen the truth. Some part of her still remembered their first apartment in Brooklyn, Harrison making pancakes on Sunday mornings, the night he cried when their fertility specialist told them Claire was finally pregnant. Memories were cruel that way. They survived people. "Why are you here?" Claire asked. "To bring you home." He stepped inside. "I've been thinking about everything. Christmas, Dad, Sienna, us." Claire crossed her arms. "And I made mistakes." "Mistakes?" "I handled things badly. That's a very clean phrase." Harrison exhaled. "I had an affair." The admission surprised her. He continued before she could respond. "I was selfish. I was under pressure, and Sienna made things feel uncomplicated." Claire gave a small, painful laugh. "Pregnancy made me complicated." "That's not what I meant. It's what you said." Harrison moved closer. "I'm apologizing." Claire looked at him. For the first time since Christmas Eve, his eyes were wet. "I love you." Her throat tightened. She hated that those words still had power. Harrison opened the Tiffany box. Inside was a delicate platinum bracelet. "I bought this weeks ago." Claire recognized it. She had once pointed it out while they walked past the Fifth Avenue store. "You remembered. I remember everything about you." For one dangerous moment, Claire wanted to believe him. She imagined going home, finishing the nursery, pretending Christmas had been a terrible fracture they could repair. Their son would have both parents under one roof. Maybe counseling could help. Maybe Harrison had finally understood what he was losing. Then he reached into his coat and removed the old Mont Blanc fountain pen. Claire froze. "You took that from my things. I found it at home before you left. That belonged to William." "I know." Harrison set it carefully on the table. "My father made mistakes too." Claire watched him. He tried to repair one. He was dying. That doesn't erase what he wanted. Harrison's expression tightened. "Claire, Eleanor is not your responsibility. Her name is Ellie. She is a stranger. She's your sister. She's a legal complication." There it was. Not sister, not daughter, not family. Complication. Claire felt something inside her settle. Harrison saw the change. "Please," he said more softly, "come home. We can put this behind us." "How?" "Let the attorneys handle Dad's estate." "What does that mean?" "It means you stop involving yourself." Claire stared at him. Harrison continued carefully. "Whatever documents you found, give them to me. The box, the letters, the keys, everything." The room became painfully quiet. Claire almost admired how long he had waited before asking. So that was why he had come. The roses, the bracelet, the tears, the confession. All roads led back to the documents. If there had been no box, Claire asked, would you be standing here? Harrison's face changed. Of course. Would you, Claire? If I had never found Ellie, never called Martin, never read your father's letter, would you have ended things with Sienna? He hesitated. That hesitation answered everything. Claire reached beneath her blouse and pulled out the thin gold chain she had been wearing. Her wedding ring hung from it. Harrison stared at the ring. Claire removed the chain. She placed it in his palm. I loved you enough to keep explaining your behavior to myself. Don't do this. I told myself you worked too much because you were building our future. Claire, I told myself you missed appointments because investors depended on you. Her voice shook now. I told myself Sienna was just work because I didn't want my son to begin his life inside a broken marriage. Harrison closed his fist around the ring. We can still fix this. No, 8 years. Claire, I know exactly how long I gave you. He stared at her. Then something colder entered his face. You don't understand what you're getting involved in. Claire almost smiled. There you are. What does that mean? That's the man I recognize now. Harrison stepped back. He picked up the flowers, left the Tiffany bracelet on the table, then walked toward the door. Think carefully before you make this public. Claire did not answer. The door closed behind him. For several seconds, Harrison stood alone in the hallway. The pain vanished from his face. He took out his iPhone and called his attorney. Daniel Reeves answered immediately. How did it go? Harrison looked back at Claire's door. File first. Daniel paused. Divorce? Yes. Are you sure? Harrison's voice became flat. And review custody strategy before the baby is born. Inside the apartment, Claire could not hear him. She was standing beside the window, one hand over her stomach, crying for the marriage she finally understood was already gone. What Claire did not know was that Harrison had stopped trying to save their marriage the moment she refused to surrender the documents, and by morning he would begin using her pregnancy against her. The envelope arrived at Claire's apartment at 8:12 the next morning. Not flowers, not an apology, legal papers. She stood in the kitchen wearing one of Harrison's old college sweatshirts over maternity leggings, one hand wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. The process server handed her the envelope. Claire Donovan Mercer. Yes, you've been served. The words were simple. Their effect was not. Claire closed the door and stared at the documents. Petition for dissolution of marriage, temporary financial orders, notice regarding future custody proceedings after the birth of the child. Harrison had filed first. Of course, he had. He had always understood the value of controlling the first version of a story. Claire sat at the kitchen table and began reading. At first, the language was neutral. Then she reached the supporting declaration. Harrison described her departure on Christmas morning as sudden and concerning. He mentioned her hospital visit, her premature contractions, her decision to travel while pregnant, her emotional distress after discovering marital difficulties. Claire stopped. He had transformed his affair into marital difficulties. He had transformed her search for the truth into instability. He had transformed abandonment into concern. Her hands began trembling. Then she read the sentence that frightened her most. Mr. Mercer is concerned that Mrs. Mercer's recent decisions may indicate impaired judgment during a medically sensitive pregnancy. Claire pushed the papers away. No. Her phone rang. Eleanor. Claire answered. He filed. Ellie was silent for half a second. I'm coming over. No. Stay where you are, Claire. If you come every time something happens, eventually I'll forget how to stand by myself. Ellie understood. All right. Claire looked at the legal papers again, but stay on the phone. I can do that. That small exchange kept Claire from falling apart. Later that morning, Claire met with a family law attorney named Rachel Morgan. Rachel was in her late 40s, direct, calm, and completely unimpressed by Harrison Mercer's name. She read the filing twice, then looked at Claire. First, breathe. Can he take my baby? Rachel's expression softened. No one can promise you an outcome, but adultery does not automatically decide custody, and neither does one hospital visit. He's saying, I'm unstable. He's creating a record. Claire felt sick. What do I do? You create a better one. Rachel pulled out a legal pad. Attend every prenatal appointment. Follow your doctor's instructions. Do not send angry messages. Do not threaten him. Do not post anything publicly. Claire nodded. Document where you live, how you support yourself, and who your support network is. My career has been on hold. Then we addressed that honestly. Claire looked down. For 2 years, Harrison had told her there would be time to return to work later, after William died, after fertility treatments, after pregnancy. Later had become a cage. Rachel continued, You were a financial analyst before marriage, before I stepped away. Can you still work part-time consulting then start? It sounded almost cruel. Claire was tired, pregnant, heartbroken, and now she needed to rebuild a professional life while preparing to give birth. But Rachel was right. Harrison had money. Claire needed structure. Within a week, she contacted 2 former colleagues. One offered her a short-term hospitality consulting project. The first morning, she opened her MacBook Air at the apartment dining table. She stared at the spreadsheet for nearly 10 minutes. Then, something familiar returned. Numbers, patterns, decisions that could be tested instead of guessed. For the first time since Christmas Eve, Claire felt competent at something other than surviving. She rented the apartment for 6 months in her own name, set up a separate bank account, transferred only funds her attorney confirmed she could legally access. She attended every medical appointment. She kept every receipt, every email, every doctor's note, not because she wanted to live like evidence, because Harrison had forced her to understand that ordinary stability might become something she had to prove. Meanwhile, Harrison continued acting publicly as if nothing had happened. At Mercer House Hospitality headquarters, he chaired meetings in tailored suits and spoke about expansion plans, but privately, pressure was building. Martin Cole had stopped returning his calls. Arthur Bennett had sent a preservation notice regarding Williams' estate records, and Sienna Blake had become distant. One evening, Harrison found her packing personal items from her office. What are you doing? Going home for the night? For good, eventually. Harrison stared at her. You're resigning? I'm considering it. Because of Claire? Sienna laughed once. No, because of you. His expression hardened. You knew what this was. I thought I did. She picked up a folder from her desk. You told me your marriage was already over. It is. You told me Claire depended on you. She does. Sienna looked at him. Does she? Harrison said nothing. Sienna continued. I saw the legal team preparing my separation package. His face changed. What are you talking about? You approved it 3 weeks ago. That was contingency planning. For what? In case this became public. Sienna stared at him. So, while you were telling me we had a future, you were preparing to fire me. That's business. No. She shook her head. That's what you call people after you've decided they're inconvenient. Harrison's jaw tightened. Sienna picked up her purse. As she passed him, she said quietly, Claire was right about you. The next afternoon, Claire left a prenatal appointment and found a voicemail from an unknown number. She listened while waiting for the elevator. "Claire, this is Sienna Blake." Claire froze. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from. Pose, but I found something in Harrison's corporate files." Claire's hand moved to her stomach. Sienna continued, "It's about you and Eleanor." Claire stopped breathing. "Please call me before Harrison realizes I copied it." The voicemail ended. Claire stared at her phone. She had spent weeks believing the most dangerous evidence against Harrison was already in William's archive. She had been wrong because the woman who helped destroy Claire's marriage was now holding documents. Harrison never meant either of them to see. Claire did not call Sienna back immediately. She listened to the voicemail 3 times. Each time the same sentence unsettled her. "I found something in Harrison's corporate files." It would have been easier if Sienna had sounded smug. She didn't. She sounded afraid. Claire sat in her parked car outside the medical building, one hand resting over her stomach while traffic moved along Madison Avenue. Her first instinct was anger. This was the woman who had spent Christmas Eve with her husband, the woman who had accepted dinners, hotel rooms, private weekends, and promises that should never have belonged to her. Claire did not owe Sienna trust, but she had learned something since leaving Harrison. Evidence did not become useless simply because it came from someone you hated. She called Rachel Morgan first. Her attorney listened carefully. "Meet in a public place," Rachel said. "Do not promise confidentiality. Do not accept anything that was obtained illegally." What if she copied company documents? Let her explain what they are and how she accessed them. Then we decide what can be used. Claire agreed. 2 hours later, she walked into a quiet cafe near Bryant Park. Sienna was already there. No designer coat draped dramatically across the chair. No perfect makeup. No Harrison. She looked younger than Claire remembered and more tired. Sienna stood. "Thank you for coming." Claire remained standing. "I'm not here to forgive you." Sienna nodded. "I didn't expect you to. You knew he was married." "Yes." "You knew I was pregnant." Sienna looked down. "Yes." Claire felt the old pain sharpen. "And you still went." "Yes." No excuse. That surprised Claire more than an apology would have. She sat. Sienna pushed a manila folder across the table but did not release it. "I need to explain where this came from." Claire waited. "I'm still an executive at Mercer House. These were documents I had legitimate access to through a brand risk review Harrison asked me to help prepare." "So you didn't hack anything?" "No." "What did you copy?" "Emails, internal memos, and a separation risk document." Claire's stomach tightened. Sienna opened the folder. The first page carried Mercer House Hospitality letterhead, Executive Reputational Exposure Confidential. Several names appeared. Eleanor Parker, Claire Donovan Mercer, Sienna Blake. Claire looked up. "You're on it too. That's why I copied it." Sienna gave a bitter laugh. "I thought I was helping Harrison manage a family crisis." She pointed to a section dated 2 months before Christmas. The document outlined possible responses if questions about William Mercer's estate became public. One recommendation read, "Characterize Eleanor Parker as an external claimant with uncertain standing." Another avoid acknowledgement of familial relationship pending counsel review. Claire's jaw tightened. He was planning the language for years, apparently. Sienna turned the page. Claire saw her own name. possible marital separation communications exposure. The document advised delaying any public announcement until after the birth of the Mercer child. Claire felt cold. There it was again. After the baby, Harrison had been planning timing, language, and reputation before Claire even knew there was a war. Then she saw another line, "If Mrs. Mercer challenges management conduct, consider emphasizing extended work absence, pregnancy-related stress, and limited recent involvement in company operations." Claire stopped reading. "He planned to use my pregnancy before I ever left him." Sienna's face tightened. "I think so." Claire looked directly at her. "And you helped prepare this?" "I helped build the first version." The honesty landed hard. Sienna swallowed. "I thought it was about protecting the company if your divorce became public. You thought my pregnancy was a public relations problem. I thought what Harrison told me was true." "What did he tell you? That you wanted out? That you hated the company? That you were staying until the baby was born because you were afraid of being alone?" Claire almost laughed. "He told me you were just an employee who didn't understand boundaries." Sienna looked wounded. For a moment, the two women sat inside the same realization. Harrison had not simply lied to both of them. He had given each woman a version of the other, designed to make his own behavior seem reasonable. Claire closed the folder. "Helping me now doesn't erase what you did. I know you were part of the worst night of my marriage. I know you don't get to become my friend because you finally discovered he was willing to sacrifice you too." Sienna's eyes filled, but she nodded. "I know that too." That answer softened nothing, but it made Claire believe her. Sienna removed one final document. "This is why I called." It was an email chain between Harrison, Jonathan Price, and a senior finance executive. Subject: Parker met her final containment. Claire read slowly. The messages discussed the $250,000 legal payment. Jonathan Price asked whether the expense should be moved out of Mercer House Hospitality before year-end review. Harrison replied, "Leave it where it is." Reclassifying it now creates questions. Claire's breathing changed. Sienna pointed farther down. "There's another email Harrison had written. If Parker resurfaces, legal should proceed with the narrative that no executed amendment was located during administration." Claire stared at the words. Not that no amendment existed, that none was located. The distinction mattered. Harrison knew exactly how to tell a truth-shaped lie. Claire took a photo of the page only after Rachel confirmed by text that Sienna could provide copies she lawfully possessed. Then Claire stood. "I need to go." Sienna rose too. "Claire." She turned. "I am sorry." Claire looked at her for several seconds. "I believe you." Sienna's eyes filled. Claire continued, "But believing your apology and accepting it are two different things." Then she walked out. Cold air hit her face as she stepped onto the sidewalk. She had gone less than half a block when a sudden pressure tightened across her abdomen. Claire stopped. She grabbed the edge of a newspaper stand. Another contraction came. Harder. Too soon. No. She checked the time. Then warmth spread suddenly down her legs. Claire looked down. Her wad had broken. People moved around her, unaware that her entire world had just changed. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone. She did not call Harrison. She did not call Rachel. She called Eleanor. "Ellie, I'm here." Claire's voice broke. "I think the baby is coming." And while Sienna stood frozen inside the cafe, watching Claire disappear into a taxi, Harrison Mercer still had no idea that the son he planned to use in a custody battle was about to arrive weeks early. By the time Claire reached Lenox Hill Hospital, the contractions were less than 4 minutes apart. A nurse rushed her through triage while another helped her out of her coat. 31 weeks? The nurse asked. 32 tomorrow. Any bleeding? No. Any complications before today? Premature contractions 3 days ago. The nurse's expression sharpened. Within minutes, Claire was connected to monitors. Her son's heartbeat filled the room, fast, steady, alive. Claire closed her eyes. "Please stay with me," she whispered. She did not know whether she was talking to the baby, to herself, or to the life she had imagined before Christmas. The doctor examined her. "You're in active labor." Claire stared at her. "Can you stop it? We're going to try to slow things down, but your body may already have decided otherwise." Fear moved through Claire so quickly she felt cold. "My baby is too early." "He is early," the doctor said gently, "but we have an excellent neonatal team here. Right now, we focus on one step at a time." Claire nodded. One step at a time, that had become her entire life. She called Eleanor again. Ellie was already on the road from Vermont. "I'm coming. Don't drive too fast. Listen to you. You're in labor, and still giving me instructions." Claire almost laughed. Then another contraction hit. Her fingers crushed the hospital blanket. "Ellie, I'm here. I'm scared." There was no hesitation. "I know. I thought Harrison would be here when this happened. I know. I thought we'd argue over baby names. I thought he'd complain about the hospital coffee. I thought he'd hold my hand." Claire's voice broke. Eleanor stayed quiet long enough to let her cry. Then she said, "You are not alone." 3 hours later, Eleanor entered the room with snow still melting on her coat. Claire burst into tears the second she saw her. Ellie crossed the room and took her hand. "I told you what? I'm here." Labor progressed faster than anyone expected. The medication had slowed the contractions briefly, but not enough. By late afternoon, the doctor stopped speaking about preventing delivery and started preparing Claire for it. A nurse asked again about the father. "Do you want us to contact him?" Claire looked at Eleanor for one painful second. Pride told her to say no. Then she thought of her son. Whatever Harrison had done to her, Noah would one day ask whether his father had been given the chance to be there. "Yes," the nurse called. This time, Harrison answered. At Mercer House Hospitality headquarters, he was sitting in a boardroom beneath a wall of windows overlooking Midtown. His attorneys were discussing the estate preservation notice. His phone vibrated. Lenox Hill Hospital. Harrison stared at it. Something in his face changed. He answered. "Hello, Mr. Mercer. Your wife is in active preterm labor. The room disappeared around him." "What?" "She has authorized us to inform you. Delivery may be soon." Harrison stood so quickly his chair rolled backward. "How soon?" "We can't say." He grabbed his coat. One board member frowned. "Harrison, we still need to. My son is being born." He walked out. For once he did not care how it looked. He did not call legal. He did not call Sienna. He did not ask what Claire had told anyone. He ran. Traffic barely moved. Harrison abandoned his Mercedes 2 blocks from the hospital and crossed the distance on foot. By the time he reached labor and delivery, he was breathless. A nurse stopped him. "Mr. Mercer?" "Yes, she's delivering now." His face went white. "Can I go in?" She asked for one support person. Harrison looked through the narrow window in the door. Eleanor stood beside Claire, his sister. The woman he had tried to remove from the Mercer family was holding his wife's hand while his child entered the world. He could not move. Inside, Claire cried out. Eleanor leaned close. You can do this. I can't. Yes, you can. I'm tired. I know. I'm so tired. Ellie pressed Claire's hand against her cheek. Then let us carry some of it with you. Minutes later, the room filled with the thin, urgent cry of a newborn. Claire collapsed against the pillows. Is he okay? The doctor lifted the tiny baby only briefly before the neonatal team moved in. He's breathing. He's small, but he's fighting. Claire sobbed. What's his name? She looked through the tears. Noah. Eleanor smiled. Noah Donovan Mercer. The baby was taken to the NICU for support. Claire watched until he disappeared through the doors. Then she cried harder than she had at any point since Christmas, not from heartbreak, from relief. Outside, Harrison heard the cry. His son, his knees almost gave way. A nurse finally approached. Mr. Mercer. Yes. Your son was born. He's stable and being evaluated in the NICU. Harrison covered his face. He cried, not the controlled tears he had shown Claire in her apartment. These were ugly, helpless tears. Can I see him soon? And Claire? She's stable. Harrison leaned against the wall. A few minutes later, Eleanor stepped into the hallway. They looked at each other. Nearly 4 years had passed since their last meeting. Harrison's face hardened instinctively, then softened when he saw blood on Ellie's sleeve from where Claire had gripped her arm during labor. You were with her? Yes. Thank you. Eleanor looked stunned. It was the first sincere thing Harrison had ever said to her. Later, Claire allowed him into her room. He stood beside the bed, looking smaller than she had ever seen him. I'm sorry I almost missed it. Claire watched him. So I want to fix this. She shook her head. Harrison, please, you can learn to be his father. His eyes filled again. Claire continued, you can show up. You can love him. You can become someone he is proud to call Dad. Harrison swallowed. And us? Claire looked toward the NICU doors. You can become his father without ever becoming my husband again. The words devastated him, but he nodded. For the first time, he did not argue. An hour later, Harrison was escorted to the NICU. He stood beside the incubator and stared at the tiny boy beneath the lights. Noah's hand barely wrapped around the tip of his finger. Harrison broke down again. Then he sensed someone behind him. Eleanor. She had come to see the baby, too. Brother and sister stood together in silence. Harrison finally whispered, Ellie. Her eyes filled. He had never called her that before. Then Eleanor looked at him and asked the one question Harrison had spent 4 years avoiding. When you told me this family didn't want me, Harrison, did you ever ask them? Harrison stared at Eleanor through the glass wall of the NICU. Behind them, Noah slept beneath warm lights, wires attached to his tiny chest. For once, Harrison Mercer had no prepared answer. Eleanor repeated the question. When you told me this family didn't want me, did you ever ask them? His eyes dropped. No. The word was barely audible. Eleanor closed her eyes. For almost 4 years, she had carried the belief that the Mercer family had rejected her. Now she understood something worse. They had never been given the choice. You decided for everyone. Harrison swallowed. I thought I was protecting them from me, from scandal, from confusion, from Dad's mistakes. Eleanor gave a painful laugh. I was his mistake. That's not what I meant. It's exactly how you treated me. Harrison looked toward Noah. I was angry. At me? At him. That answer surprised her. Harrison leaned against the wall. My whole life, Dad told me the Mercer name meant responsibility, discipline, reputation. Then suddenly near the end I discovered he had another daughter. Eleanor said nothing. I thought everything I knew about him was a lie. So you punished me. Harrison's face tightened. Yes. It was the first time he admitted it without hiding behind lawyers or business language. Eleanor's eyes filled. You could have called me once. I know. You could have asked what I wanted. I know. You offered me money before you offered me a chair at the table. Harrison looked ashamed. I know. Eleanor nodded slowly. Good. He looked at her. Good. At least now you're finally telling the truth. She walked away. Harrison did not follow. 3 weeks later, the first formal estate mediation began in Manhattan. Claire attended remotely because Noah remained under close medical supervision. Her attorney, Rachel Morgan, sat beside her. Eleanor joined from Arthur Bennett's office. Harrison appeared with 2 attorneys. No cameras, no reporters, no dramatic courtroom, just documents, lawyers, and people forced to answer questions they had avoided for years. Arthur produced correspondence showing William had executed the trust amendment. Martin Cole produced the archived digital copy. The delivery receipt confirmed the signed amendment had reached Price, Adler, and Kent after William's death. Then came the email Harrison had sent. Do not circulate the Hale Amendment until I decide how the family wants to handle it. Harrison's attorney tried to frame the delay as uncertainty over William's mental capacity. Arthur responded calmly. I witnessed the execution. Mr. Mercer was lucid, informed, and fully aware of the document. The mediator asked the obvious question. If there were concerns about his capacity, were those same concerns raised regarding the business documents he signed during that period? Silence. Claire watched Harrison on the screen. For years, he had controlled rooms with confidence. Now, facts were controlling the room. The estate issue did not destroy Mercer House hospitality. It did not transfer the company to Eleanor. The truth was more realistic. William's personal estate had to be reopened and reviewed. Eleanor had a legitimate claim to the share William intended for her. The company payment tied to the attempted settlement also triggered a separate governance review. 2 independent board members demanded outside counsel examine whether Harrison had used corporate resources for personal family matters. Harrison was not fired, but he temporarily stepped back from several executive decisions while the review continued. For him, that humiliation was almost worse. He had built his identity around control. Now, every important decision required someone else's signature. Meanwhile, Claire's divorce moved forward. Harrison's attempt to portray her as unstable weakened quickly. Her medical records showed she had followed every recommendation. Her consulting work demonstrated income and professional stability. Her apartment lease, prenatal records, and documented support system showed planning, not recklessness. Rachel reminded Claire that none of this guaranteed a perfect custody outcome, but Harrison's narrative was losing credibility. Most importantly, Claire refused to use the affair as a weapon against his relationship with Noah. She wanted clear boundaries, not revenge. Harrison would have parenting time appropriate to Noah's age and medical needs. He would receive updates. He would be expected to show up. One afternoon, Claire found him sitting outside the NICU. He looked exhausted. How is he? Harrison asked. Stronger. Can I see him? Yes. Harrison stood, then hesitated. Claire? She waited. I'm sorry about the filing. The divorce, the way I did it. Claire studied him. You were trying to scare me. Yes. Why? His answer came slowly. Because I couldn't control what you knew anymore. For the first time, Claire believed the apology, not because it erased anything, because he had finally stopped pretending his motive had been love. A week later, the Mercer family received notice that William's estate would be formally reconsidered. That same afternoon, Eleanor's phone rang. The caller was Caroline Mercer, Harrison's aunt. Eleanor almost did not answer. When she did, Caroline cried before she spoke. "I didn't know." Eleanor closed her eyes. Caroline continued, "If I had known you existed, I would have called." For the next hour, they talked. Not about money, about William, childhood, family photographs, the brother Caroline remembered, and the father Eleanor barely had. Before hanging up, Caroline asked one question. "Would you come to Christmas dinner next year?" Eleanor could not speak. She looked across Claire's apartment where Noah was finally home from the hospital, sleeping in a bassinet near the window. For nearly 60 years, Eleanor had believed there was no place for her at the Mercer table. Now, someone had finally pulled out a chair. She whispered, "Yes, but there was still one empty chair nobody knew how to fill, because the next Christmas would force Harrison, Claire, and Eleanor into the same room for the first time since the truth came out." 1 year after Claire walked out on Christmas morning, snow covered the roads outside Woodstock, Vermont. Inside Eleanor Parker's house, everything felt different. The dining table had been extended with an extra leaf. A ham rested in the oven. Christmas music played softly from the kitchen. Near the fireplace hung 6 stockings. One belonged to Eleanor. For the first time in 59 years, her name was part of a Mercer family Christmas. Claire stood beside the tree with Noah in her arms. He was almost 9 months old now, healthy, curious, and fascinated by anything that reflected light. He reached toward a glass ornament. "No," Claire whispered, laughing as she pulled him back. Eleanor watched from the doorway. "He has Harrison's stubbornness," Claire smiled. "Please don't tell me that on Christmas Eve." The joke was gentle now. A year earlier, Harrison's name had been able to destroy an entire room. Now Claire could say it without feeling something collapse inside her. The divorce was final. The custody agreement was working. Claire had returned to hospitality finance on a flexible consulting schedule. Eleanor had received the portion of William's estate he had legally intended for her after months of mediation. Mercer House Hospitality had also completed its governance review. Harrison kept his position, but new controls required independent approval for certain legal and financial expenses. He had not lost everything, but he had lost the privilege of treating a family company like an extension of his personal will. Claire considered that fair, not revenge, fairness. At 6:30, Caroline Mercer arrived carrying 2 pies. Then came 2 cousins Eleanor had never met. There were awkward introductions, long pauses, a few tears. Caroline brought an old photo album. Eleanor sat on the couch, turning pages slowly. She saw William as a teenager, William at college, William holding Harrison as a baby. Then she found one picture of her father wearing the same cheap winter jacket he had worn in the photograph from her childhood. Eleanor touched the page. "He kept this jacket for years." Caroline looked confused. "You remember it?" Eleanor nodded. Claire watched both women realize how many stories had existed on separate sides of the same family. At 7:15, dinner was ready. Everyone moved toward the table. Then Claire noticed the empty chair. No plate had been placed there, but the chair remained. Eleanor saw her looking. "I invited him." Claire did not need to ask who. Did he answer? No. Eleanor folded a napkin. I told him the invitation didn't mean everything was forgiven. Claire nodded. It shouldn't. I told him it only meant the door was open, and he said he understood. They sat down. Noah occupied a high chair between Claire and Eleanor. Caroline began saying, "Grace." Halfway through, headlights moved across the front windows. Everyone went quiet. A car door closed outside. Claire felt her body stiffen before her mind caught up. Eleanor looked toward the door. A knock followed. Nobody moved. Then Eleanor stood. "I'll get it." Claire watched her cross the room. The door opened. Harrison Mercer stood outside alone. No driver, no assistant, no tailored overcoat that looked prepared for a magazine photograph. Just a dark wool coat, snow on his shoulders, and William's wooden box in his hands. "Merry Christmas," he said. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "You came?" "I almost didn't." "Why?" "Because I wasn't sure I deserved to." Eleanor stepped aside. That wasn't the question. Harrison entered. He saw Claire, then Noah. His expression softened immediately. "Hey, buddy!" Noah recognized his voice and kicked excitedly in the high chair. For a second, Harrison looked close to tears. Claire gave him a small nod. Not affection, permission. Harrison walked over and kissed his son's forehead. Then he noticed the empty chair. He sat. Dinner began awkwardly. Nobody knew whether to discuss the past or avoid it. Eventually, Caroline asked Harrison about Boston. A cousin mentioned a hotel renovation. Eleanor talked about expanding the bookstore. Slowly, the room began to breathe again. After dessert, Harrison carried the wooden box to the fireplace. "I brought this for Ellie." Eleanor looked surprised. He placed it on the table between them. Inside were family photographs, William's Mont Blanc pen, copies of the trust documents, and several personal letters Harrison had found while sorting through storage. "I should have given these to you years ago." Eleanor touched the box but did not open it. Harrison stared into the fire. "I told myself I was protecting Dad." Nobody interrupted. "I wasn't." His voice became quieter. "I was protecting my place." Eleanor watched him. "I grew up believing I was his only child. Then I found out you existed." Harrison swallowed. "And instead of being angry at him, I became angry at you." Claire felt the room change. This was not an excuse. It was finally an admission. "I thought if the family accepted you, something that belonged to me would become smaller." Eleanor's eyes filled. "What?" "My importance." Silence. Harrison gave a bitter smile. "Stupid, isn't it?" "No," Eleanor said. "Small, but not stupid." He nodded. "That's fair." Then Eleanor asked the question that mattered. "Are you sorry because you lost control or because you hurt me?" Harrison looked at her. Both. It was not the perfect answer. That made Claire believe it. Eleanor's chin trembled. "I can't forgive 4 years in one night." "I know. I may never forgive all of it. I know." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Eleanor pulled out the empty chair beside her. "Sit closer." Harrison stared at her. "Why?" "Because dinner's getting cold and I'm tired of talking across rooms." He moved the chair. No embrace, no instant reconciliation. Just 6 inches of distance disappearing. Later, Claire stood near the Christmas tree while Harrison sat on the rug, helping Noah stack wooden blocks. For a brief second, she remembered another Christmas. The cold dinner, the Tiffany ornament, the door closing. The woman she had been that night would have believed healing meant Harrison coming home. Claire understood better now. Healing meant she no longer needed him to. Eleanor approached the fireplace carrying a final stocking. She hung it carefully beside the others. Ellie, her fingers remained on the fabric. Harrison saw it. His eyes filled. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Parker was not a secret, a claimant, or a complication. She was family, and when Claire looked at the Tiffany ornament waiting inside its box, she realized Christmas morning still held one final moment that would prove how completely her life had changed. Christmas morning arrived quietly. No dramatic phone calls, no lawyers, no reporters waiting outside, just snow against the windows, the smell of coffee from Eleanor's kitchen, and Noah laughing because someone had placed a red knit hat on his head. Claire stood near the fireplace holding the Tiffany ornament she had bought the year before, baby's first Christmas. The engraved date had felt cruel when she first opened the box. Back then, she had imagined hanging it with Harrison beside her. She had imagined a perfect family photograph, a husband, a wife, a baby, a home that felt permanent. Now she understood how little permanence had to do with appearances. Noah reached toward the ornament. Claire smiled. Careful. Eleanor came up beside her with 2 mugs of coffee. You ready? Claire looked at the tree. Yes. She lifted Noah into her arms and helped his tiny hand touch the branch. Together, they hung the ornament. For 1 second, Claire could not breathe. Not because she was sad, because she remembered exactly who she had been 1 year earlier. A woman standing alone beside a cold Christmas dinner. A woman listening to an elevator carry her husband toward another woman. A woman who believed being abandoned was the worst thing that could happen to her. Claire looked around the room now. Eleanor was laughing. Caroline was trying to stop Noah from pulling ribbon off a gift. Harrison sat across the room, watching quietly. He had stayed overnight in a nearby hotel instead of assuming he belonged under Eleanor's roof. That mattered. Small choices mattered now. Harrison approached Claire carefully. Can I hold him? Claire handed Noah over. Of course. Harrison lifted his son and kissed his forehead. Noah grabbed his father's collar. Harrison laughed. It was a sound Claire had not heard in a long time. For several months, Harrison had followed the custody schedule without complaint. He attended pediatric appointments when invited. He stopped sending gifts as substitutes for time. He completed parenting classes voluntarily after Noah's premature birth frightened him more than he wanted to admit. None of that repaired the marriage, but it helped build something else. A father. Claire had learned that consequences did not have to destroy someone to change them. Sometimes consequences simply removed every excuse. Eleanor's bookstore changed too. The portion of William's estate she eventually received was meaningful, but not enormous. She used some of it to renovate the second floor and open a reading room for local families. She named it the Eleanor Parker Reading Room, not William Mercer. That had surprised everyone. When Claire asked why, Eleanor had smiled. I spent too much of my life waiting for someone else's name to make mine important. Claire understood perfectly. Her own life had changed in quieter ways. She returned to hospitality finance. At first only 15 hours a week, then 20. Eventually, she built a consulting practice, helping smaller hotel owners review acquisitions and debt structures. Her office was not on Park Avenue. It was a bright room in her apartment with a MacBook Air, stacks of financial reports, an Amazon box full of children's books, and coffee she forgot to finish most mornings. Claire earned her own money again. More importantly, she trusted her own decisions again. Sienna Blake left Mercer House Hospitality in the spring. She accepted a position with another company in Chicago. Before leaving New York, she mailed Claire a handwritten note. No excuse, no attempt to become friends, just 3 sentences. I am sorry for the part I played. Thank you for believing the truth when I finally told it. I hope Noah grows up surrounded by people who never ask him to choose between honesty and love. Claire kept the note, not because she forgave everything, because she no longer needed anger to remember what happened. Harrison's corporate review ended with restrictions, repayment of improperly allocated legal expenses, and stronger oversight from the board. He kept his company, but he did not keep absolute control. That was perhaps the most fitting consequence. The man who had spent years deciding everyone else's place in the family now had to live inside boundaries other people could enforce. After breakfast, Harrison found Claire alone near the porch. Snow covered the yard. "You look happy?" he said. "I am." He nodded. "I used to think hearing that without me would hurt." "Does it?" "Yes." Claire looked at him. Harrison gave a small smile, but not the way it used to. They stood quietly. Then he said, "I'm sorry for Christmas." Claire knew which Christmas he meant. "I know. I thought leaving for one night was the mistake. It wasn't." "No." He looked through the window at Eleanor holding Noah. "The mistake was believing everyone would still be there after I kept choosing myself." Claire said nothing. He finally understood. That was enough. Not reconciliation, not romance. Understanding. Later, everyone gathered around the tree for a photograph. Harrison stood beside Eleanor. Claire held Noah. Caroline adjusted the camera timer and hurried into place. The picture was imperfect. No matching clothes, no expensive photographer, no carefully controlled image, just people who had survived the truth. After the photo, Claire remained by the tree. Her eyes found the small ornament. A year earlier, she had told Harrison, "Go spend Christmas with her." At the time, she thought she was losing her family. Now she understood she had finally stopped losing herself. She had not become richer because of revenge. She had not needed a billionaire to rescue her. She had not won by destroying Harrison. She won because she stopped asking betrayal for permission to leave. She built a life where her son could know his father without watching his mother disappear inside a marriage. She gave Eleanor a place at the table, and she gave herself one too. Claire kissed Noah's head as he reached for the lights. "Merry Christmas, baby." He laughed. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, nobody was missing anymore. 1 year after Claire disappeared on Christmas morning, she finally understood the truth. She had never been running away from her family. She had been walking toward the first life that was truly her own. So this is where Claire's story finally settles. If you're still here with me, thank you for staying all the way to this moment. Claire was betrayed. She was misunderstood. She was made to look emotional when she was actually seeing the truth clearly. She hurt deeply, but she did not beg. She did not chase Harrison down the hallway. She did not fight for a place in a marriage that had already stopped protecting her dignity. She left not because leaving was easy, but because staying would have cost her too much of herself. That is the quiet strength in this story. You cannot control who lies to you, who misunderstands you, or who chooses someone else. But you can control what you do next. You can choose your dignity. You can choose your peace. You can choose yourself again. And yes, life may still hand you cold coffee, awkward family dinners, and people who test your patience before breakfast, but you can still move forward. If this story meant something to you, comment one word: dignity. And if you enjoyed being here, a like, share, or subscribe would mean a